How's it going? Doing okay? It's going to be 0 degrees next week, right? Where do we live when 0 degrees is something to get excited about? That's a weird thing. Welcome, glad you're here. We're in the second week of our brand new series entitled Everything is Terrible. We're looking at the book of Lamentations. We spent time in the first chapter last week, and we came to this conclusion after our talk that maybe when you and I walk through trial and suffering and pain, those aren't moments to be escaped or explained away. Instead, perhaps those are moments that God is calling us into to listen, to watch, and actually just sit and be a part of it. But in the midst of that, perhaps one of the most radical things we can do is actually worship God in those moments, in an act of defiant worship. And defiant in this way, because there are moments when I'm in pain and suffering and trials that I don't want to worship God. I don't want to acknowledge God, but I do the opposite. I condition myself. I coach myself. I discipline myself. I force myself sometimes to worship in those moments because I know it's the right thing to do. And this week, as we hop into the second chapter of Lamentations, I need to warn you that the rabbit hole is only going to get darker and deeper. It's a heavy chapter, but I also want you to know that I am a fellow journeyer with you on this. The things we're going to talk about this morning are not things that I have a handle on, but we're doing this together, and I think that's an important thing. So let's hop into the second chapter of Lamentations. It starts like this. How the Lord has covered daughter Zion with the cloud of his anger. He has hurled down the splendor of Israel from heaven to earth. He has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. Without pity, the Lord has swallowed up all the dwellings of Jacob. In his wrath, he has torn down the strongholds of daughter Judah. He has brought her kingdom and its princes down to the ground in dishonor. Ugh. It's tough. When we read a passage like this, it seems like something has happened to God. He's changed. He's reversed on himself. Because when God is described in this way, I don't know who he's talking about. Because I knew God as someone who is merciful, who is good, who is loving, and the picture that the narrator paints here in the second chapter of Lamentations is someone completely different. God's gone from being the hero in my life to actually my enemy. Where he used to show mercy, it's reversed now. He doesn't show it anymore. And the narrator drops a few things here and there to give us clues to that. One of the words he uses in this passage here is the word footstool. And footstool might ring a bell for you if you were part of our Genesis teaching series about a year ago. We talked about the creation narrative and how that footstool imagery shows up in Isaiah, but also how in the creation of the world, God puts everything together sort of like a temple, and the last piece he puts in his image is us. So this picture of this connection, this love, it's part of him. But now what the narrator is painting for us here is like God has actually sort of kicked his footstool aside. He's put it to the curb. He wants no part of it. There is a disconnect between him and his creation. Then the narrator uses words like the day, or later on he says, the day of the Lord. And if you're familiar with any Old Testament passages, when this term comes up, it usually means God gets up off his chair, he sticks out his chest, he comes to the rescue of his children, and he smites all the enemies. The trouble is, when we read the day of the Lord in Lamentations chapter 2, there is yet another reversal. Who's the enemy here? It feels like we are. And what happens as the chapter continues is that the narrator will give other illustrations and images and metaphors that will show off this transition, this reversal, and leave us wondering, have we become the enemy or has God become our enemy? Just because I don't want to read them all to you, I put them all here in block letters because they're really angry. This is what it says. God destroyed, God broke down, God brought down, God cut down, God withdraws his protective hand, God burned, God bent his bow, God killed, God poured out his fury, God becomes like an enemy, God destroyed, God multiplied mourning, God abolished, God spurned, God scorned, God disowned, God delivered into the hands of the enemy, God determined to lay in ruins, God stretched the line, God did not withhold his hand from destroying, God caused lament. And when you group them all together like this hurts. There is obviously a reversal here. There has been a change from hero to enemy. Who is this God that we are talking about here? And to a much, much lesser degree, it reminds me of a friend of mine, actually, who had not only one, but 2 vasectomies. All right, so he gets the procedure done and then reverses it. and then gets the procedure done and reverses it again. So after the second operation, I went to visit him because I thought it was just really funny. I'm like, this is great. What are we going to talk about? Are there pictures? How does this work? So I show up, and he's not in a joking mood whatsoever. He is not happy. And very seriously, he looks me in the eye, no smile, nothing. He just says, grapefruits, Joe. Grapefruits. I'll let you think about that for a second. And there's a sense here of this is what the narrator is beginning to explain, again to a different degree, but something has been cut open. Something is swollen. Something hurts. You're unable to move, and there is no bag of frozen vegetables big enough that's going to make the pain go away. So there's this feeling here. What do you do with it? It's awkward. God has reversed things. He's gone from taking his hand and making it a hand of protection to being on the defensive for us to now it's offensive, and now it's a fist. He used to heal us and help us, and now he's actually hurting us. He's demolishing life as we know it. So one of the first questions that rises out of the text for us this morning is this. What happens when it seems like God's hand is reversed on us? When it goes from protection, from defense to offense? What happens when it seems like God has completely checked out of our lives? I know my gut reaction, and maybe yours is the same. I just want to blame God. I want to say, why have you done this to me? This is absolutely your fault. But what if that isn't even the case? You see, with Jerusalem, God has actually left by their own request. You see, in the years leading up to this, it was kind of a shady time for these people, where they, through their actions and through their motives, were saying, God, I don't want you a part of this. I don't want you a part of our lives. I don't want you a part of what we're doing here. So please leave, step off, go away. We don't need you. So what God actually does is give them exactly what they're asking for. This long defiance of God was actually a request to say, okay, you want me to leave? Then I'll leave. And this leaves them disillusioned, as it would us. And it stems from this feeling of surprise, like, oh, I can't believe God has done this. I mean, does our punishment really, our actions really warrant the punishment that we're getting? And then it brings up these other confusing questions. Well, who is God then? I have this expectation of who God is. There's this reality of who God is. And this character of God, is it what I always thought it was? So another question then rises out of the text for us this morning. And it's this. What do we do when we get what we asked for from God? Like Jerusalem, through our actions and through our patterns and rhythms and motives, we're actually saying, God, no thanks, get out, I'm going to do this on my own. And when God actually lets us do life on our own and we get upset with it, well, what do we do? And what happens when our expectation and our reality of God and Christianity and life don't exactly match up? I wonder if this is perhaps the greatest challenge that faces us as modern North American Christians, is that we have this weird sense that somehow God owes us something. He owes us something for coming to church and doing this. He owes us something for following Jesus. And some of us have actually thought that the reason we actually signed up to be Christians was to get a safe, happy, clappy life. And then what we do is actually we manufacture our Christian experience around this idea. And if we continue to do it over and over and over again, what we actually get is this. We have churches of the nicest, kindest people who have nothing apostolic or missionary, who never knew the soul's despair or its breathless gratitude, and we end up with a civic religion, positive, happy, and affirming, but in no way commensurate with the grand epics that play themselves out in the lives of the most ordinary people. We are left with suburban piety that fails to reach the hardy rebel inside each of us. Somehow, when we shape our Christian experience in this way, when we put these types of expectations on God like he owes us something because we're doing him a favor for doing church, somehow there we actually condition ourselves to believe that it's the church's job to remove any sort of pain or discomfort that may be part of our lives. But meanwhile, Part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, part of what it means to be the local church, is to actually have this sense of holy discomfort. There's this uneasiness when we recognize the sin that's inside of us. There's this confrontation with the evil that breeds inside of us. To be a Christian, to be part of the church, is to have this friction with the outside world, recognizing that the way things aren't the way they are supposed to be. And that you and I are actually supposed to be taking an active role to undo some of those things, undo some of that evil, undo some of that sin, and not actually take an active role in participating in it. But here's the thing. It has become very awkward to talk about sin these days. Awkward. It's almost like a dirty word even in church. And this morning I feel a bit weird standing up here talking about judgment and talking about punishment and God's correction, because I don't like any of those feelings. I don't want to face into my own darkness. My shame, my pride, my guilt, that kind of stuff just makes me want to hide and disengage from everything. And then it gets real awkward when God actually deals with the sin and the brokenness that's in my life and in yours. And again, the knee-jerk reaction is, well, I'm offended by it. How dare you say that about me? Why would I want to be part of a faith like this? It gets all awkward. We try to explain it away like we talked about last week. And then faith becomes this tough sell. Because if you don't preach a happy, clappy God that makes life safe and easy, then why would anyone ever want to be a part of it? And when we think about sin in this way, when we think about God's judgment, his punishment, his correction in this way, sometimes we've come to this conclusion that the reason God judges and punishes is because he wants to get even with us. Like we've done something wrong. There was that one thing we did wrong last night, and now the next day he's going to punch his fist through this planet, get retribution from us. But that's not how it works. We've talked about sin before in this way. Sin isn't necessarily a collection of deeds that you do. It's this heavy cloud that sort of sits over everything that we are. So God is not getting even or getting back with us. Perhaps then it's a different way. There's a different way we have to process this. And I would ask you to consider it this way. That the point at which that God is most vehement with Israel over her disobedience is the point at which the Bible most dignifies us. Okay, this is starting to make a lot more sense now. Because through Lamentations, the reason the Bible takes sin so seriously is because God takes people so seriously. If sin is this destructive force that is undoing all of God's good creation, if it destroys what he loves most, which is namely us, if it has the potential to poison everything that we put our hands to, then no wonder it sends God off the deep end. So when we think about sin and judgment and God's correction and punishment, he is angry about these things because he is actually fighting for us. Because he knows where sin leads. He knows its destructive nature. He knows what it would do for us. So he actually steps in to correct, to make sure that we actually have life. Because if he didn't care about you and me, if none of this mattered, he would just dust his hands and say, forget about it. Whatever happens, happens. I don't care. But because you do matter, because all of this matters, he steps in. So when we talk about sin and judgments and correction, God, in and through those things, is actually saving us. And saving us from what? Saving us from ourselves. And that's why I think it's okay when we put up a fight with God. I think it's okay when he doles out his punishment and justice, we get upset and uncomfortable. Because that's a clue that it's actually hitting us at our root, hitting us at our core, at the center of who we are. So I think in a way, God actually invites our pushback. And what we're going to see here is the narrator is going to speak up again in this second chapter of Lamentations. And it's almost as if he is putting words in God's mouth and they're directed at Jerusalem. He says this, The hearts of the people cry out to the Lord. Your walls of daughter Zion, let your tears flow like a river, day and night. Give yourself no relief, your eyes no rest. Arise, cry out in the night. As the watches of the night begin, pour out your heart like water in the presence of the Lord. Lift up your hands to him for the lives of your children who faint from hunger at every street corner. Now you'll notice here that this almost sounds the same as that earlier rant that we read, where God is this, and he raises his hand, he bends back his bow, and he crushes, and he sends fire. This is that same sort of tone, but it's flipping it around, reversing it yet again. So if I was going to collect all those and put them in the same format we did earlier, it's like this. Pour down your hearts, Jerusalem, or people. Do not give yourself a rest. Do not let your pupils be still. Arise, cry aloud, pour out your heart. Lift up your hands to him. So what the narrator is suggesting to Jerusalem and to us is to actually get God's attention in the same way God got our attention. He's saying, get out there. Be real. Don't hold back. Don't be fake. Be truthful with where you're at and with what you're feeling. Do not hide anything. Actually, you know what? Confront God on all of it. It's an invitation for us to actually protest the situation that we are in. To actually let God know in a raw, very real way how we're feeling and where we're at. And God invites it. And now the woman, the second voice, remember from last week, she's actually going to take the narrator's cue right here, and in protest, she repeats this back to the Lord. She says, look, Lord, and consider, whom have you ever treated like this? Should women eat their offspring, the children they have cared for? Should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? Young and old lie together in the dust of the streets? My young men and young women have fallen by the sword? You have slain them in the day of your anger. You have slaughtered them without pity. As you summon to a feast day, so you summon against me tares on every side. In the day of the Lord's anger, no one escaped or survived. And those I cared for and reared, my enemy has destroyed. So the woman, Jerusalem, takes the cue from the narrator and is honest and upfront and raw and real. So what Lamentations is allowing for us here is it actually gives us a language to voice our pains and our complaints. Lamentations becomes this form of prayer that actually legitimizes the pain and challenge and struggle that you and I find ourselves in. Lamentation gives permission to pray these kinds of prayers without holding back. Because at the end of the day, God is not afraid of what you are feeling. God is not afraid of your words. And I would say, this is my opinion only, I don't even think God cares if we use foul language in describing it. You know why? Because for some of us, maybe that's the real part, where there's no holds barred, where it's not as clean and tight and pretty as all this, but God might be getting the all of you, the real you. And maybe, when we confess it all out in this way, perhaps it becomes part of our healing process. But perhaps also it allows us to participate in the healing of others. Because if we allow ourselves to be raw and real in this moment, if we allow ourselves to be in this place of pain and suffering, then maybe it's in that place that we actually feel and are able to see the world as God does. Let's back up the train for a second. Back to verse 13. The narrator says, how can I understand your plight, dear Jerusalem? What can I say to give you comfort, dear Zion? Who can heal you? The cry goes out there. You're bare, you're honest, you're broken. Everything about you is laid out cold. The narrator says, well, who's going to do something about this? Later on in verse 14 and 15, he lists some people. He says, your prophets. Could your prophets heal you? Well, they did not. Well, what about the passerbys? Did the passerbys heal you? No, well, actually, they could not. What about your enemies? Did your enemies heal you? No, they would not. They would not heal you. So who then? When you're open, you're bare, you're raw, You're truthful. You're telling it like it is. You are protesting the situation that you are in. Who's going to hear you? Who's going to heal you? I wonder if it's in those moments that we actually get a taste of what God tastes. I wonder if when we allow ourselves to be in those moments, we actually become more aware and more attuned of the brokenness that is inside of us and the brokenness that surrounds us. And for us, maybe as a church, it actually helps us become more like Jesus. Our old friend Henry Nouwen explains it this way when he says, a Christian community is a healing community. Not because wounds are cured and pains are alleviated, but because wounds and pains become openings or occasions for a new vision. Mutual confession then becomes a mutual deepening of hope, and sharing weakness becomes a reminder to one and all of the coming strength. So maybe what Lamentations is getting at for us this morning is for us to not rush through or eliminate the challenges that we find ourselves in. Instead, maybe for now, for this season, this is exactly where we're supposed to be. Because this is where Jesus is. This is where he has us. And maybe it's in those moments that we actually become aware of the broken pieces inside of us that actually need to be healed. I'm going to invite Matt to come back out here real quick. And we've left the last 3 or 4 minutes of our service to sort of end things in a way that we usually don't. I don't know about you, but unless I take intentional time, carve it out, to be reflective and think about things like we've talked about this morning, it never happens. So I want to gift you these next few minutes just for that. And I want to throw 3 questions out to you based on the things that we have talked about. And I want to give you a moment in these last few minutes of our time here together to think about them, to reflect on them, to confess, to repent, or maybe say what needs to be said to God. So for some of you here this morning, the right question is this: where has God shown up in your life like an enemy? Where does it feel like he has removed his hand of protection and replaced it with this offense? Where does it feel like the Spirit is actually poking at something in your life, trying to delicately get at something that you know is broken, that perhaps you've just kept quiet and hidden? Or maybe the question to you this morning is this: where have you bought in to suburban piety? Where is it that you have convinced yourself that your life is all about having a squeaky clean, happy, clappy, safe, suburban, whatever. Keep the trouble way out there, and I'll keep my own kingdom and castle safe right here. Where have you fooled yourself into that? And what is God's Spirit saying to you in the midst of that this morning? Or lastly, for some of you, when was the last time that you actually voiced confession? When was the last time that you were actually raw, open, and honest with God? Laid yourself bare, like the woman's voice here in the 2nd chapter, saying, God, look at all that has happened. I'm here in protest. I'm here in confession. I am here in repentance. I want to give you the next 2 or 3 minutes. Matt is going to sing softly. I would encourage you not to sing along with him. But grab one of these questions, the one that might seem the best for you this morning. Take 2 or 3 minutes, reflect, and then we'll close in prayer together. I'm going to invite you to stand with me here this morning. And as we close in prayer, I'm going to invite you to assume a position or a posture here if you feel so comfortable. This is a posture of just surrender and submission. It's our body language saying, God, whatever you want. And I give up. I give up. Will you pray with me this morning? Father, this morning we do come before you with this posture of body and my prayer and this posture of heart, where we can come before you just raw and open and honest with exactly where we find ourselves today. Father, I pray that you would be the grand enemy in our lives, the one that pulls apart the pieces that aren't supposed to be there. And in those moments, through our actions or through our ideas where we have disinvited you from being part of our lives, yes, God, use those moments to carve out the pieces in us that just don't belong. And God, when it's painful and when it hurts, when we feel awkward and we want to lay blame in so many directions, remind us of what the scriptures said this morning, that your correction and your discipline actually dignifies us. It's saying that we matter to you. Help us to hold on to that when we want to run in the opposite direction. And Father, for those of us who are here today, who go days and weeks and months without offering confession, without talking to you honestly and openly, God, will you bring the things that were started here this morning back to mind in the coming days? God, will you reopen those lines of communication so that we can know you deeply and that we don't sink into this suburban piety where all we're thinking about is ourselves and our own lives. Help us to be like your Son, Jesus, in every way. In your good and holy name we pray. Amen. Love God, love others, tell his story. If you want to sit tight, you're more than welcome to. If you want prayer, people will meet you here to my left. If not, head out to the lobby, get some chili, say hi to someone new, and we'll catch you next week.